You are listening to the Norton Library Podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the first of our 2 episodes devoted to Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Other Writings, as we interview its editor, Caroline Levine. In part 1, we discuss Stevenson's life and career, his friendships, and the society he reacted against. We explore how this novella came to be, how the narrative is structured, and what a Jekyll and Hyde narrative is in the first place. Caroline Levine is David and Kathleen Ryan Professor of the Humanities at Cornell University. She has written 3 books: The Serious Pleasures of Suspense, Victorian Realism and Narrative, Provoking Democracy, Why We Need the Arts, and Forms, Whole, Rhythm, Hierarchy, Network. She is the 19th century editor for the Norton Anthology of World Literature. Caroline Levine, welcome to the Norton Library Podcast.
So great to be here.
Well, we are so pleased to have you. Why don't we start by talking about Robert Louis Stevenson? Who was he, and what do we need to know about him as we approach Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde?
Sure. I mean, he has a double life, so it's pretty appropriate to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He grows up in this incredibly stern, pious Presbyterian household in Scotland. And his whole family are these super respectable, kind of repressed and repressive people. And as a young man, Stevenson starts really rebelling, and he goes and hangs out in brothels and bars and seedy neighborhoods, and he's a rebel. So he's not like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the sense that he puts on a respectable appearance, but he's like somebody brought up in this really strict religious household who then, hangs out with artists and refuses to abide by respectable rules. And as soon as he can, basically, he leaves Edinburgh, where he's grown up, and he travels all over the place. He basically never settles down. He's in France, he's in England, he's in the United States, and he ends up, at the very end of his life, settling in Samoa, small Pacific island, and really becoming beloved there and being very angry about British colonialism around the world, but particularly in Samoa. So he's sick a lot of his life, and he ends up writing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde while he's in bed. So poor guy. But while he wasn't traveling, and he was kind of famous as a travel writer first, he was sick in bed writing kind of incredible books about the world.
Well, he was famous as a travel writer, but also as a children's writer. Isn't that how some of us know Robert Louis Stevenson?
Yeah. So Treasure Island and Kidnapped are just classics of children's literature. I have to say that I was a little bit of a rebel myself when I was a kid, and I refused to read books that were only about boys. And so I did not read them as a child. But that's part of Stevenson's work, is that his books are almost entirely about men, and it's kind of fascinating. He does not have women characters.
Interesting.
They arise very rarely in his work.
Is there something in his biography that would explain that?
I think this is an interpretation based on especially Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but that he's really quite critical of the old boys club that is running the world. And so he's actually really interested in giving us access to male power, and that he's not on board with it. So, women in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are all victims. And so there's something about the way that women suffer in this world of men that to me is super interesting. He certainly seems to have had a lot of women acquaintances, and he was very passionately in love with his wife, who was an American 10 years older than he was. And she sometimes gave him advice on his work. So, like, I don't think he hated women.
No, it's not a misogynistic exclusion.
No.
Like the little
Right.
girl at the beginning of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So can you also explain how Samoa came to be? It just seems like a random place to end up for somebody from Scotland.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think he really wanted the opposite of uptight Scottish values. And he went to Hawaii first, and he had a really wonderful reception in Hawaii. They were very excited to have him there, and he stayed there for a little while. And I think, you know, he was exploring the South Pacific. I don't know that he meant to actually end his life in Samoa. He was seeing the world, which he loved to do, but he was quite sick. So, you know, he loved it there in Samoa, and he was very much incorporated into Samoan life. So they gave him the nickname of the storyteller. And so I don't know how long he would have stayed if he hadn't died of natural causes.
Are his remains in Samoa?
They are. They're on the top of a hill, and often visited by tourists.
Incredible. You mentioned his wife was helpful often in his own composition and editing process. How does that bear upon the creation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde?
Well, it's one of my favorite stories, although it's also a terrible story for people like me who study writers in the past. So apparently he wrote a first draft of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and he read it aloud to his wife. And she said, well, that's super entertaining. You know, it's a good story, but it's kind of shallow. And so what did he do? He threw it into the fire. So we have no idea what the first draft was like, which is maddening. We still want to see a writer's process, you know. But on the other hand, it was a sign of how much he respected her, and also of how seriously he took what I think a lot of readers have taken from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is there's a lot of philosophical and scientific and religious interest in it. It is not a shallow book. So although he published it kind of in a really cheap edition so that it would be sensational and popular and lots of people could read it, he did take her advice in making sure we were kind of thinking hard too while we were reading this exciting plot.
And how long did it take him to write it?
That's a good question. I don't actually know. It's pretty fast. He was, among other things, a fast writer.
You mentioned that Stevenson was keen to have this be a commercial success. Was it?
It was. It was a huge sensation on both sides of the Atlantic. So there was a lot of back and forth across the ocean where British books were read in the United States and Canada and vice versa. And it was an immediate bestseller. You know, part of it has to do with the cost of the book. So he was very clear that he wanted it to be published as what was nicknamed the shilling shocker. So these were like sensational books that only cost a shilling, and a shilling is not a lot of money. It's always hard to do exact comparisons, but it's about the price of a pound of butter in England at the time. And so it's also it's really the first time that most working class people in Britain could read. So there's a Universal Education Act in 1880 so that, you know, everybody gets to go to school. Before that, you've got lots of working class kids who are in factories and in mines, and they're supporting themselves, and so they can't go to school. So by 1880, you've got this huge class of readers, and you've got new technologies of print and paper production so that they're cheap. So ordinary people can afford books and know how to read in large numbers in the 1880s. And that's when Stevenson is writing for this huge new popular audience.
Were his other books like Treasure Island and Kidnapped, were those also commercial successes?
Yes. And he made use of kind of what was a new phenomenon of niche marketing. So up until about 1850, and I'm speaking very generally, there are exceptions to this, but like most books are sort of expected to be read by most people who could read. Like there isn't a set of like, oh, these are books for women and these are books for men or whatever. But in the 1880s and 90s, when you get this sudden explosion of print, you get these new magazines like boys magazines and ladies magazines, right? And so this idea that different groups of people want different kinds of reading. And so Stevenson was just a huge hit in the world of boys literature. And this idea of, kind of making strapping, adventurous young men from their reading.
You mentioned that Stevenson was befriended by artists and he traveled in kind of artist groups. Who were some of these people and how did that sort of help his development, or both his intellectual development and his artistic development?
He was friends with a lot of kind of bohemian, very kind of experimental or innovative writers and artists. And so although we might associate him with popular fiction, he's definitely thinking about sort of like how to innovate and what the new kind of experimental modernist styles are. So he's friends with Rodin, the sculptor, who he's friends with Henry James, who's, very serious novelist, although also dabbled in ghost stories. But so he's friends with lots of people who are on the cutting edge of the arts. And one of my favorite stories about him is that he absolutely loved Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. That was for him one of the great books of all time. And Henry James couldn't stand it and said it was like being ill reading Crime and Punishment. And Stevenson was like, no, this is the best thing that's ever been written. So, he's having debates and discussions with other artists and writers about what is, what should you be writing in the 1880s when literature is got a whole bunch of new readers, when there's all kinds of new experiments in the air, who's writing what? And he's definitely in the conversation.
So, Caroline, this is one of those books where even somebody who hasn't read it understands the basic plot, that we have a split personality in this man. Is there something about this plot of the split personality and good and evil that Stevenson was drawing on from the culture or from this historical period? Is there a logic to it coming out in 1886, for instance?
Yeah, it's such a great question. One of the things that's fun about reading Stevenson and knowing a bit about the 19th century is how much he's weaving into the plot. And so you can read different kinds of contexts into it. One of the most interesting and most kind of sobering is that the United Kingdom had just passed a law called the Labouchere Amendment, which was supposed to criminalize any kind of sexual relationships between men. So there's this rising fear about homosexuality at the time. And so much of Stevenson's innuendos and suggestions, if you don't know the plot before you start, which his 19th century readers would not have, right? He's famous to us, but the story is famous to us, but it wouldn't have been in 1887. But people would have definitely guessed that it was a sexual secret, right? So these men are hanging out together late at night. One has a key to another one's house. Hyde's address is Soho, which is right at the heart of the sex trade in London. And so there's a lot of talk about appetites and pleasures. And so Stevenson seems to be, at the very least, building suspense by focusing on the possibility that there's sexual relationships between men that they're trying to hide. But I mean, I think on the other hand is also this set of questions about what are people's secret appetites. And there's a whole new interest in sexuality that's emerging at the time. A field called sexology emerges right at the same time that Stevenson is writing. And it's all about like what's normal sexuality and what's deviance and, who gets to say what's natural to a person's desires. And so all of these kinds of questions that we're used to in our own time were just emerging right then. So that's part of what Stevenson is drawing on. He's also drawing, I think, on just a really long tradition of a question about good and evil. Are humans, are we naturally good or evil? But he's putting it in a scientific context to think about how we might, it's partly science fiction, right? This book, although we don't always think about it that way. It's about, could you, with drugs, turn somebody into somebody else? And what could science do? And how much can science push at the limits of what we consider to be human nature or human character? And that's also a debate that's still going on for us, but which other writers at the time. Certainly, the young H.G. Wells is starting to think about those questions right at the same time. They're also thinking about it.
So modern psychology, modern science, sexology. So these are all woven in. Stevenson's engagement with modern psychology, are secret desires, are they conscious or unconscious? Would a person, for instance, a reader in the late 19th century, be aware of, let's say, secret desires or not?
Some scholars argue that Freud really learned a lot by reading 19th century novels. Yeah. That is the idea that we have some unconscious desires that we try to suppress, and we try to keep them even out of our conscious minds, right? Because they're dangerous, like aggression or lust or these kinds of things that, maybe we don't want to admit to ourselves. The 19th century novel is actually pretty good at bringing to our attention. And so Stevenson is writing at the same time as Freud, although Freud will be much more famous later. But they seem to be coming to kind of a similar conclusion. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you have that same experience between a kind of higher consciousness that's able to organize and control the lower consciousness, right? That's doing that has all kinds of evil appetites. But I think it's super interesting that in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Jekyll is aware of his other side. He's aware from the very beginning. And so it isn't an unconscious, it's more like an embarrassing consciousness, like a shameful consciousness, which is, I think, super interesting. But also, I think part of what's a little bit different from the Freudian model of repression is that it's more about the social world. Freud agrees with this too, right? The social world teaches us that we have to keep these desires under wraps and under control.
So we have public and private selves.
Exactly. So the private self can be perfectly conscious of what it wants.
Right.
It just is never going to bring it out into public.
To make this universally applicable, what Stevenson is writing, let's just assume we don't all have evil twins that they're trying to hide. Is it a more universal interpretation simply to say there are things we hide from the public? They're just not exactly what we present on an everyday basis, even if they're not murderous or dastardly or diabolical.
Yes. I feel like it's one of the great draws to this story is that so many of us can really relate to it, whether it's like, I should, not eat an extra cookie, but I'm going to eat an extra cookie too, do I have really shameful desires that I want? Almost all of us have felt that kind of like, in social situations where what you really want to say is not socially acceptable. And so most of us have felt some kind of struggle that way. But I think it's important to always to think about what literary studies and other scholars in the humanities have drawn our attention to over the past 30 years, which is that there's very little that's actually universal. And so most of what we relate to comes from our own culture and our own cultural context. And so it's a very dominant theme in sort of British and Anglo-American culture to be split between what you want to say in public and what you don't want to say. But not all cultures kind of share that sense of a split.
Just one other question about this point, and I hope I'm not carving this up too thinly, but I think in the 21st century, if you have a secret self and a public self, you kind of think that the secret self is your true self. But in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is that inverted or are they equivalent? Who is the real person in that twinning?
Yeah, I love that question. Because I think Stevenson's really thinking about it. And, at one point, one of my favorite moments, Dr. Jekyll says, I'm not a hypocrite. It's not that I want to do one thing and appear another. It's that I actually have two pieces of myself. They're both real. And I find that really fascinating because I think we do sometimes in our culture we say, people are naturally selfish, or, and the Victorians did not agree with that. Many of them would have said people are naturally good or drawn to good, and what Stevenson is saying, no, we're all both. We have both things going on inside us. They're both real. And so it's worth thinking about, how do we know what's really basic to ourselves? Where do we get those ideas from? I think often we don't even necessarily know that we're getting them from culture, right? We're getting them from books we read, from whatever religion we practice, right? Has ideas about where good and evil live in ourselves, and psychology has ideas about it, and evolution has ideas about it, right? So we're like constantly trying to figure that out.
Is there any evidence, I'm thinking of like yin yang, where yang has a dot of yin and vice versa. Is Jekyll purely Jekyll without any Hydeness in it, and vice versa? Are they really like lightness and darkness? Is it that binary as you put it?
I mean, Stevenson seems to undo the binary as the plot goes on, right? So they start out being really separate, but then they get closer and closer and closer, and they can't. Then there's a moment when Jekyll totally loses control over whether he's Hyde or Jekyll, right? And so he keeps trying to assert the scientific self and be like, oh, if I just can get the right, the right drug, I can go back to being in control. He also ends up increasing the dose, which I think is super interesting because It seems to be addiction, right? There's a lot of language in there that sounds like addiction, like I gotta have the drug and I've got to, and then I'm getting used to it. And so I have to bring it up. And so you can think about the ways in which an addict also becomes somebody else, right? Under the influence of drugs. But, I do think that Stevenson is maybe more asking the question than telling us about whether we're two selves or whether we're really one with two parts, because he likes to blur distinctions. And it's one of my favorite parts of the novella that whenever there's a reference to urban space, and there's a lot that's about setting in this novel that's super interesting, he'll blur the boundaries. So you'll be on a dingy street with a beautiful house, or you'll be in a beautiful house on a dingy street, and then you're not quite sure where one house starts and another one ends. And Mr. Enfield realizes at some point he's just surprised to understand that Dr. Jekyll's front door and the door that starts the story are front and back entrance to the same house. And so, like, are they two people or are they the same space? And if you think about yourself spatially, which I think we do, we're like, oh, I have this, higher consciousness and lower one, right? You're using spatial metaphors to describe who you are. It's kind of like the unconscious and the conscious mind, or the savage and aggressive mind are constantly being like too close to the civilized and more controlled mindset. Even in the space of London, everything is getting all jumbled together.
Yeah, your introduction points out a lot of those dualities and how Stevenson manipulates it. I thought that was just a fascinating observation. Another thing that your introduction discusses or places Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in as a work of literary fiction is the Victorian era. And so what does that mean? This is a Victorian novel. Is this a typically Victorian novel, or is it just happened to be published in 1886? How would you gauge that?
It is, I think, a really good example of a late Victorian novel. So for those of us who study and teach Victorian literature, we might think about Charles Dickens or Charlotte Bronte or George Eliot as kind of consummate Victorians. They're all a good couple of generations before Stevenson. So the earlier period is kind of the height of the British Empire. Britain feels very confident of its own superiority to the rest of the world. They're also carrying out a lot of violent conquests of the rest of the world, which Stevenson was very opposed to. But by the end of the century, they start to be more troubled. Like, what if Victorian culture isn't, what if British culture isn't like the height of civilization? And scientists in particular are kind of starting to point out that, like, this idea that the British are civilized and these other parts of the world are savage isn't really true. Like, we all have animal parts to ourselves. And Darwin, whose Origin of Species was published in 1859, really rocks the Victorian world with this idea that maybe humans are not special, we're not distinctive, we're not even the highest beings, we're just sort of accidents of evolution, and we're animals, really. Primarily, we're animals. And the writers of the period really grapple with this, and they grapple with the idea of what gets called degeneration, the idea that if you could reach kind of some height of civilization, you could either find inside that these other more savage characteristics. That's their terms, not mine. I don't believe in savagery and civilization. That's Victorian terms. Or maybe Britain could be on the downslope. Like, maybe you could hit the height of civilization and then start degenerating. And so a lot of the novels at the end of the 19th century are really concerned about this kind of question of what is civilization and how stable and solid is it?
Isn't Mr. Hyde described in Darwinian terms at times?
Yeah, so it's one of the other themes that Stevenson weaves through the plot, which I think is so brilliant, along with sexology and psychology and science. Hyde is ape-like, sometimes called ape-like, and troglodytic. So this notion that he comes from an earlier moment in history before evolution has produced these more advanced human beings. But what's cool about it, and cool about the way Stevenson thinks about that, is that it's actually inside the civilized person, right? It's not a temporal division anymore. It's not a before and an after. It's not, oh, look at those people who live in these remote places who aren't as civilized as we are. It's like, oh, we British people, we're the ones who have these animal characteristics inside us. And so the idea that these are the really powerful people in society. You know, these are the lawyers and the doctors and the professional men who run society, like Dr. Jekyll, are people who have savagery inside them. And so to my mind, one of the things Stevenson is doing is using a kind of Darwinian logic to undo an imperial idea of British superiority and civilization.
Caroline, we haven't really talked about the Gothic. Does this book qualify, or because it kind of takes place in everyday society, does it qualify?
Yeah, I mean, the history of the Gothic is a great story, and it kind of starts in the late 18th century, where writers start experimenting with ghosts and supernatural themes, and they usually set their fiction in faraway places and times. So, like in Renaissance Italy or medieval France, they'll set these kind of ghost stories and put them at a remove.
It's got to be a castle involved somewhere, right?
A castle, and usually a woman trapped in the castle, an innocent girl trapped in the castle, and a man who is out to violate her or in some way entrap her. But by the middle of the 19th century, there are all these Gothic themes that are incorporated into sort of more realistic fiction. So Jane Eyre borrows a tremendous amount from the Gothic, but is in a contemporary realist setting. And so by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, I think the Gothic is kind of woven into a lot of what people are writing, that kind of question about what is ghostly, what is from another world, where do we draw the line between what's realistic and what's supernatural? And so I think it definitely counts. I do think it's noteworthy that Stevenson draws so much on science. So it's like a cross between Gothic and science fiction in certain ways, which is also true of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein back in 1818. So it's not the first time that those are mixed together, but I definitely think he's drawing on that.
The last thing that I would like to ask you about with regards to the composition of the novel itself is I'm interested in the chapters and the chapter titles, which got me thinking about the way that he structures it. And it's almost like these chapters are each kind of self-contained narrative in and of themselves. What do you observe about the way Stevenson the architecture of this story?
The title of the whole thing is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the story itself seems to draw on both medical and legal cases for its structure. And so you get not one continuous narration, but a series of documents. Some of them are legal, some of them are scientific. You get all kinds of papers and testimonies. And so there's a way in which it's mimicking a kind of either medical or legal case and putting bits and pieces together to add up to a whole, like a diagnosis or a guilty verdict. And you could see it as both of those things by the end, both medical and legal. But I think my favorite part of it is that it opens with a title, The Story of the Door.
Yeah.
As if the whole book is going to be about a door. And in some sense it is, right? It's a door inside somebody, between their two parts, but you don't know that yet. So you think, well, why am I reading a story about a door?
It's like the portal that you go into.
Yes, it's a portal.
And then that last chapter, the statement.
Yes, and it's, right, this is Dr. Jekyll's confession, but it's also a whole life story. He starts from the very beginning. So it's almost as though you get all the way inside the text and then there you are and you start all over at the beginning, which is kind of interesting. But then also one of the famous things that scholars have pointed out about the novel is that it gets further and further inside the truth, not just in terms of the documents that it reaches, but also spatially. So you first start out in the anteroom of Dr. Jekyll's house after seeing the door. Then you go inside, and then you get inside the laboratory, and then you get inside his room. And then inside the room are these documents, and then you have to open the documents, and so it's like a movement inside spatially, which is also a movement towards knowledge.
Caroline Levine, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast and discussing your new edition of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Other Writings. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you, Mark.
The Norton Library edition of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Other Writings, edited by Caroline Levine, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.